The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Lord be with all of you. Let us pray. This is my favorite prayer for guidance. O compassionate Jesus, friend of sinners, yet God incarnate, giver of life, thank you. Help us to know what to do and when, what to say and how, so that we may be of some help to somebody, some way. Amen. We are privileged again to have Dr. Adam Miglio with us today, and he's going to be talking about the period of Israel's history in the Solomon and the Temple period. And so since we've already introduced him, we are going to get started. So, Dr. Miglio.
Being on the North Shore, we probably could talk about the Cubs, right? But we won't. We will talk about Solomon this week, and next week we'll talk about ancient Israel, the Old Testament period, and then our last time together we'll transition into the New Testament. Today we'll focus primarily on Solomon. Last time we were together, just to give you the sense of where we're going, a roadmap, if you will, I tried to introduce the discipline of archaeology, and then also to argue or offer an apology for how archaeology and the Bible can be mutually illuminating, and in particular, how we as the people of God can benefit from integrating archaeology with the Bible. Today, then, what I want to do is to take a case study of Solomon and to reflect upon kingship. So I'm going to do three things, right? In classic church fashion, I have 3 points. The first one is I want to talk archaeologically about symbols of kingship in ancient Iraq. I'm going to start in ancient Iraq because kingship in ancient Iraq is where we first have kingship, and it predates kingship in Israel by thousands of years. Then I'm going to transition. We'll talk about symbols of kingship in the reign of Solomon and in ancient Israel. And then lastly, I want to ask the so what question. As the people of God, how can we take this data from archaeology, integrate it with our Bible, and begin to say, what does it mean to live faithfully as the people of God? In particular, I want you to be thinking about how someone like Solomon comes along and knowing the promise of God that he's going to make Israel a great nation, how Solomon's going to adapt and adopt those symbols of kingship that are already around. And the challenge, Solomon, and for us today, as we adapt and adopt cultural symbols, the challenge to do that faithfully as God's people. So that's where we're going today. That's what we're going to cover. That's the topic I want to linger on a little bit together. When I mentioned symbols of kingship, and we start thinking about archaeology, kingship, of course, is an abstract concept. We don't actually have wonderful self-reflective treaties, on what kingship was in the ancient Near East. We have to look at artifacts that are not texts, mute artifacts, if you will. And so just to sort of prime the engine or prime the pump, pick your metaphor, I want us to just stop and think about how symbols of politics today work. I promise to tread lightly. I know we're in a political season, and I really don't want to go into it. All I want to do is simply note that we have symbols in our own day and our own age that communicate quite clearly to us about politics. Whether it's the White House, just think for a moment about what the White House communicates. It's not the White Palace, right? It's the White House. It says something about the leader of this democracy, that he or she is someone who is one among the many, from among the people, not necessarily set apart by class or in some sort of inherent quality different from the rest of us. There's no divine right of kings. They live in the White House. You could add to this, of course, the famous presidential seal, which has that Latin inscription on it, out of the many one. A seal or symbol that screams and communicates quite clearly for us about what our commander, our leader is. Likewise, you could think of, well, I know it's just a Boeing that's been retrofitted. Air Force One is what we refer to it as, right? Air Force One. And as soon as I say that, Air Force One, and when you see Air Force One, it conjures certain roles for our leader. It's a symbol. Our leader doesn't fly commercial class or first, they fly in Air Force One. They are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They're in charge of the military in all of its branches and divisions. These are symbols that we readily understand. Now, most of you, many of you have probably traveled, you've had cross-cultural experiences, and so you know symbols don't work across cultures always that easily. I'm going to show you some, and I picked some kind of to, because they're interesting. But I want to step into those symbols from ancient Iraq and consider what they communicate about kingship there. And the first one for us, well, I want you to see some beautiful artifacts. That's part of the fun of archaeology. They're lovely, lovely artifacts. But I also want you to see how they're very different or foreign. And we'll come ultimately to what they're a symbol of, or what this first one is a symbol of. But first, just take it in for a second. This is a gorgeous gold helmet. It was actually excavated by the British, Sir Leonard Woolley, on behalf of the British Museum. You can see the puncture marks at the bottom here. Do you see these going around? Beautiful etching in the gold. It was probably lined with leather or some other perishable and worn. It was found, in fact, in the tomb of a king by this particular king, whose name was Mes Kalam Dug. What I want you to note is that this is a symbol of kingship that goes back to probably the 4th millennium BC, or the turn of the 4th into the 3rd millennium BC. That's around 3000 BC. Solomon, right, signposting, fast forward, around 1000 BC. Symbols of kingship that are deep and trenchant long before Solomon. Solomon's going to bear the mantle of being leader of a great nation. And he's going to have to ask those questions. What symbols do I use? What am I going to do to project kingship? The symbol here isn't the helmet, or maybe it is. But in particular, it's the hair bun. It's the hair bun, right? That's a weird one, right? In some ways, you're taken aback by it. The hair bun isn't often a symbol today, or at least not of kingship, a royalty. I want you to see it. It goes throughout Mesopotamian or ancient Iraq's history as a symbol of kingship for thousands of years. This next artifact was actually recovered it's recovered in a context from around 700 BC. So now we're after Solomon. We're still in Iraq. We're actually at a site near modern-day Kirkuk. And you can see it. It's a gorgeous piece. It's not a helmet that would have been worn. It's probably a mask that had some sort of votive or cultic function. But you'll notice, just cut off on the side here. You can see it there. There's that hair bun again. There's that hair bun again. This is a part of that tradition in ancient Iraq of what it means to be king. It connotes kingship. It's a symbol of kingship. But what does it symbolize? Let me show you. Here, we're now going to go back in time just a little bit, but it nicely helps to illuminate what this symbol meant. Here we're looking at a stela from ancient Iraq. You can see the date up here. It's around middle of the 3rd millennium, 2400 BC. It's fragmentary. All of these nice smooth places here have been are just simply holding in place these larger pieces that were recovered. But you can note, if you look real carefully, particularly on this piece there, do you see you can make out which one of these is the king? Simply by the hairstyle or the helmet that he's wearing. Moreover, here in this narrative art, that is, it's art that tells a story, and you kind of get fragments of the story, but you can tell what's going on. The king is doing what? He's leading the troops into battle. And over again, we see this symbol of kingship, much like Air Force One, connected with military. So you see the king up here, leading, of course, this phalanx-like arrangement of troops, or in the lower register here, he's on some sort of wheeled cart or maybe a chariot with the troops arrayed behind him. In both contexts, there's that symbol of kingship. He wears the hairbun or the helmet. Our symbols of kingship in ancient Iraq, this one in particular, get at repeatedly the idea that the king is military leader. He's a warrior. We're going to come back to it for Solomon. But I just simply want to call attention to it. It may be a bit odd that is the hair bun as a symbol, but I do want you to note, here's one of those, and you guys will remember, my college students now, I invoke Saddam Hussein, and they sort of look at me glassy-eyed, like, who was that? He's been dead for over a decade, he's been dead for a decade now, right? So they're young. But here you can see Saddam, every year, he would hold a festival in Babylon, in Baghdad. He called it the Babylon Festival, in which he would celebrate the history of his country. And there you can see the relief from that artifact we just had, which was in the Baghdad Museum, the phalanx troops, and of course he himself is presented as military leader, not with the hair bun, but with the modern equivalent thereof, the beret, right? The beret. He dons the beret as the military leader in this context, evoking, and in fact, in this sense, probably a fairly sophisticated reading of our ancient artifact there from Mesopotamia. First symbol I want you to think about, kingship. Kingship in Mesopotamia is associated with warrior, military leader. The next one, what I want to do, rather than necessarily look just at art, but look at a series of archaeological remains that convey how the king in Mesopotamia, in ancient Iraq, was thought of as the provisioner of prosperity. Again, nothing's new under the sun. The old adage, it's the economy, right? It's the economy. The provisioner of prosperity. To do that, I want to look at what is really a spectacular archaeological find by the French at a site right here. It's called Mari, M-A-R-I. And it's a site that's about 17 kilometers just over the border into modern-day Syria, over the border of Iraq and Syria there. And we'll take a close-up look at it and some of the material finds there now. Mari, as you can see here, there's the site. We talked about Tells last time. There's the site of Mari. It's located right along the Euphrates River. And it was, in fact, even much closer to the Euphrates River in antiquity. This is important for understanding the site. We'll come back to it in just a second. You'll also notice off to the west as well as to the east, it's really steppe land, almost desert, what's often referred to as the Jazira and the Shamia, respectively. This is important, again, in terms of the symbolism we're about to see, the king as the provisioner of prosperity. When the French began to excavate this site in the 1920s, 30s, and really haven't hardly ceased since then, one of the things they uncovered was this monumental palace. It was a palace with more than 300 rooms. It's a palace that yielded all sorts of gorgeous preciosities, thousands, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. And I want to walk through this palace with you. Not all 300 rooms, just 3 of them. Just 3 of them. Because I want you to see how a king presented himself as the provisioner of prosperity in this palace. Now, when you think of this palace, and as we look at these 3 rooms here, when you think of a palace, you think generally, of course, of its function. In antiquity, much as today, in the White House, for example, these sorts of residences of the leader, of the king, were meant for entertaining. You would often have vassals coming to pay tribute, or other kings arriving for the purposes of diplomacy. And the intent was to impress upon them, of course, your power, and that you were the presider, or the one who presided over prosperity for your kingdom. And we're going to see exactly how intentional this was and how wonderful, really serendipitous our archaeological record is as we consider the palace here. We're going to go from an open courtyard into what is essentially a liminal sort of in-between waiting room, ultimately where number 3 is then, which is the throne room of the king. Now, we have remarkable material to show us how to read the experience of someone who arrived at this palace. Let me show you, and we'll start here. I'll show you some reconstructions of this here. We're now in that open courtyard where archaeologists found the remains of a palm tree in the center of the courtyard. This is lovely. This is lovely. Our texts from the palace describe it as the court of the palm. It's the court of the palm. But more important than this small little tree stump, archaeologists found what you can see here reconstructed, and I'll show you a larger image there, a gorgeous fresco. And this fresco really provides a template. It prepares the person who arrived at the palace to experience these 3 rooms appropriately. They were a key, a legend, if you will. Let me show you a nice big blown up image of it. You'll see here the 2 palm trees on either side, right? And in fact, they're flanked on either side of the palm trees, that is, with these strange composite beasts. In biblical parlance, we'd call them cherubim, right? Those things that protect the divine presence, are in the divine presence. Palm trees, cherubim, Reminds you in the biblical text maybe of Genesis chapter 3. Remember that? The trees, the cherubim set to guard it. Provisioner of prosperity, the adjective we use in English. This king wants you to see how he presides over an Edenic kingdom. An Edenic kingdom. We're going to move past these palm trees into a second room, signified here by what is, I'll show you in just a moment, a female goddess. You'll notice she has 4 rivers flowing out of her pot and a small little tree or plant growing there. And there, our final room, the throne room, where the king is being greeted in a complex scene by the god, in this case actually a goddess. This is our legend. We'll walk through it. You encounter the Court of Palms, you see this beautiful fresco, and then you would move into the next room. All the while, the whole city, remember I said it was situated on the Euphrates. Palm tree, Edenic connotations. All the while, the city, and right by the palace, we have cut a canal, which is used to water the king's gardens. And we know from the texts from ancient Iraq that one of the things kings collected were trees. They were botanists. You didn't know that, right? They were botanists. They collected trees from throughout their empire. The best analogy I can give to you is the way in which, of course, today's zoos, in the modern period, or at least not long ago, functioned this way. It was a big deal as a kid when a panda bear was given by China to the D.C. Zoo. What was so important about that? It's not that they couldn't, that is the U.S., afford to catch a panda, but it was a sign of the far-flung diplomatic connections. So two kings in antiquity planted gardens, and they dragged trees back from the corners of their kingdom to symbolize how they presided over prosperity. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. We walk past our Court of Palms. We have this idea of an Edenic context, and now we're standing actually in the threshold, in the doorway between that large Court of Palms, and just to give you a sense of perspective, into that next room where you have a young Arab boy from the 1930s standing against the remains of this wall of the palace. You'll see there's on either side other entrances as well, which we'll come to. And as excavators dug down, they found this wonderful little platform, a gorgeous platform, and actually face down, in front of this platform, they found this woman, a female deity. She's the very same female deity you see in that fresco. Remember I said to you it was our legend, our key about what we're going to experience. She's holding, and you can see in profile here, she's holding a small vase. She's hollowed out, the vase is hollowed out for water to flow out of it. The picture portrays coming out of the 4 rivers flowing from the vase. The 4 rivers sounds like Genesis 2, doesn't it? Eden imagery. She's holding this pot which contains flora, some sort of plant. And here I simply want to come back to and camp on just for a second because it's going to be important for us. The idea that plants, flora, is connected in the ancient world with females. That's why a female deity is holding it. Now that connection I want to tease out just a moment. I think it's probably apparent to you why there's that connection, is both females in antiquity and, of course, plants are associated with fertility, one and the same. And so in a lot of our myths, the earth and its foliage is connected with females because of seeds, reproduction, fecundity. In Iraq, this was something to revel in. This deity is the one who gives to the king prosperity for his kingdom. So as you go visit him, you see his wealth, you see the prosperity, and you see the source of it. And when you show up, there's a reconstruction of her. She would have stood probably on the podium. There's some liberties here, but it's a nice reconstruction. And then ultimately, you would have entered before the king with a clear sense in his throne room of what he was. The symbols communicate to you who he was. Are there questions on our symbolism or thoughts? There's our frame with our king there from the fresco in that first room. Are there questions on our symbols from ancient Iraq?
Did that fountain work? Was that pot, did that water flow out of that pot?
It's hollowed out as if it should. We don't know how it would have worked, or if it would have worked as a fountain today, or perhaps just periodically. That is, could they have used it or used it for display on occasions? I don't know. I've never seen a good explanation of it, but to note that the statue is hollowed out. And when you couple it with the fresco, it seems to me they would have used it somehow, right? Somehow. Maybe it's just as a pot. I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah?
Is it a dog in the center?
No, this is actually a lion or a lioness, which is the animal that's associated with this particular female deity. Her name is Ishtar. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question, though. It's a good question. It's a gorgeous fresco because I think in so many ways it brings images we only read in the biblical text and says, look, here's some of those images in that culture, in that context. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have a comment on how Solomon would look to one female deity, and yet he had so many wives?
I want to come back to that because I do want to talk about how there is a female deity. We, of course, know from the biblical text Solomon's indicted for patroning. So maybe I can come back to that question in some ways, but I think the simple answer, or perhaps the first half of the answer would be, there's always, even in the ancient Near Eastern pantheons, one or two female deities who are considered to be the supreme female deities. The structure of the pantheon is that of the family, and there's a patriarch and there's a matriarch, and there's the rest. And so there's a sort of natural pecking order even in the pantheon. Can I transition to Israel? Symbols of kingship in Israel. Now here I need to remind you, of course, of the biblical text just a little bit. I know you've been discussing it and working through it, but one of the things we encounter very early on in the biblical text and in the narratives of kings later on is this idea that God's promised that Israel would be a great nation. All the way back to Genesis 12 and 15 and 17. God calls Abraham and he says, you're going to have lots of descendants. And you're going to be a great nation who will inhabit this land. Those are the three promises. Many descendants, great nation, inherit the land. So the idea of being a great nation is on the table very early. We then find this fleshed out in the book of Deuteronomy, where in Deuteronomy we read, when you ask for a king, and I quote here, like all the nations, make sure your king is this and not that. There's a long list of what the king's supposed to be and not supposed to be. Some of them are odd, and if we had time, we would unpack them, right? A king, one of them we know he's not supposed to have lots of wives, but he's also not supposed to have lots of horses, but he is supposed to be an Israelite, and he is supposed to read the book of the law. So there's a long list of, but the key is you're going to have a king like all the nations. Because kingship is a legitimate way of functioning as a state in the ancient world. Again, if I can draw a contemporary analogy, you see today throughout the world presidents of many states. Just because they have presidents, of course, doesn't mean they're democratic in practice or in theory. But really, to be a state today, you need kind of a president, maybe a prime minister. You can't run around and say, I'm going to invent a state and my leader is going to be called a whatever and behave however. There's a certain sense of what it means to be a leader in this international context. And the biblical text affirms that. You're going to be a great nation that anyone will look at and be able to understand, I made you into a great nation. And so Solomon's going to be confronted with, because he's our first real king. You remember the stories of Saul. If you read them closely, there's some tribes who follow Saul. There are some that don't. It's a very small kingdom. David, as late as David, David conquers Jerusalem. But David really doesn't have the ability, because he spends so much time on the run from his sons who are trying to steal his power, to do any serious building or putting of the state on a firm foundation. Solomon does it. And so Solomon's the one who's deliberately crafting and presenting kingship in Israel. Now here's the perennial question for the people of God. As we engage culture, as people who are involved in cultural engagement, it's a tricky business. We will assess Solomon when we get to the end of it. You know what's on the table for Solomon at this point. Some of the things Solomon's going to present are not going to strike you as surprising, and I want to dip into some of those passages of Scripture that we tend not to read, right? The passages where for chapter after chapter it talks about the detail and the ornamentation of the palace that Solomon built. Because that's where the symbols are. Let me call to your attention this one from 1 Kings 10. Solomon, 200 shields of hammered gold, 7.5 pounds of gold went into each shield. 300 small shields of hammered gold with 3¾ pound of gold in each shield. And these are used to adorn his palace as decorations. Now you all know, right? I often ask my undergrads when we read this passage, why does he have these on hand? And every once in a while you have that student who's like, yeah, when they go to war, they're going to take these. Wait, they've never been engaged. They've never done ring shopping, right? Gold is a great thing on a finger. It's not a great thing in the battlefield. It's incredibly heavy and it's incredibly soft. This has everything to do with conspicuous consumption, right? I'm a king who's wealthy, which is one thing it projects. They're made of gold. But if it was just about projecting wealth, why wouldn't you make ornate gold leaf shaped like a, I don't know, whatever. But they're shields. They're military accoutrements. Solomon, as best we can tell, we don't know what his hairstyle was like. We don't know what his hairstyle was like. Was keen on projecting himself as a military leader, even though he spends very little time actually on the battlefield. David does all the conquering, right? David does all the conquering. But he's going to project symbolically. He's a great king. This is a great nation. When you come and visit my palace, you'll see I'm a warrior, just like all the kings of all the nations. This is the first symbol. This is the first symbol. We don't have much archaeologically there, but we do for the second symbol. What are you looking at? You're looking at a very young me. But what you're really looking at are these here. Really looking at are these here. And you might be able to make out, particularly from the one on the left-hand side, dozens of these have been found in the archaeological record. So now we're actually dipping into the archaeological record. The one in the upper right corner actually comes from Jerusalem. This one over here from a site called Hatzor. This one from a site called Megiddo. These are important sites because the biblical text says these are sites built by Solomon. Solomon's a great builder. And he decorates a lot of the monumental architecture that we have, that we can say is Solomonic, with these. Can you tell what it is there? I know it's an odd shot. No. I've gotten politics deep into your brain here, right? They're pillar caps. These are pillar caps. I work in a building which is an oversized colonial building, but it's a building which has these beautiful Corinthian pillars. We know the Corinthian pillars, right? They are stylized palm trees. These are stylized palm trees before the Greeks. You can kind of see it, right? They stood on these pillars, and we find them all throughout Israel, both associated with the Solomonic constructions, but also later kings in Israel, who put them, in fact, one of the beautiful palaces we have about 4 kilometers south of Jerusalem, on top of all of their pillars in their palaces. We read in the biblical text, we won't go there entirely today, but we read in the biblical text, these also were used to adorn, oh, sorry, I apologize for that. They also were used to adorn the temple. The temple, the palm tree, the same exact symbol used by Solomon, both in temple and, more importantly for our purposes, in palace, with the intent of communicating what? Exactly what you saw, better preserved archaeologically, to be sure, in Syria, but the idea that he's the provisioner of prosperity. Not altogether surprising, right? Not altogether surprising. Moreover, if you read the biblical text clearly, we know where Solomon gets this idea. Mari, I showed you, was in Syria. When you read real carefully, Israel is an upstart nation. They don't even have the tradesmen and craftsmen to build the temple and palace. And so Solomon, the biblical text says, 3 times over, sent to the Phoenicians in Syria and Lebanon so that he could have the resources and the craftsmen to accomplish these building projects. He wants to be a king like all the nations. You send to the people who look like real kings to do it for you. Also, another example for you, and I'll show you a picture in just a second, a reconstruction to tie it all together. These are balustrades. Like you may think of them as a bit taller balustrades than these because they're probably found on top of a limestone slab, but that you might imagine on a balcony. Right? Today we might put wrought iron, put together in this fashion. There you can see this is a reconstruction of a palace that's been found in Jerusalem, which some have suggested is associated with David and Solomon. It's still a big debate. Not enough's been excavated. But it's a reconstruction nevertheless. But you can see those palm trees. You can see that balustrade on the balcony. And the way in which this was meant to communicate these symbols who the king was. Who the king was in Israel. Warrior and provisioner of prosperity. I can add to that, of course, again, I know these are sort of obscure passages in Scripture, but I love them because they help in terms of archaeology. You're now looking at a reconstruction of Jerusalem from the time of Solomon, actually just a little bit later. Temple at the top of the Temple Mount, right? Up in the north. There's the palace. We also know, maybe you've heard of it, the water supply for Jerusalem is called the Gihon Spring. It's the gusher. In Hebrew, it means the gusher. You can walk it today. My kids and I walked it this last summer. They loved it. You can walk underground. It's a tunnel underground for about 2/3 of a mile that brought water into the city. Well, the water system before that dumped somewhere else. It dumped out here. And we know from the biblical text as well as from archaeology, because this has been extensively excavated, if you had to create a channel for the water to a pool where everyone could go to draw it, what might be a nice sort of side benefit? They dig channels off to the side to water the king's garden, which we find reference to in the biblical text repeatedly. One of the more famous and clear examples in the book of Kings, chapter 25, famous and clear, right? But not really that famous and clear. It's famous and clear for some people, I suppose, who read that way. But it describes how people were trying to escape the city of Jerusalem when the Babylonians came, and how they did it through this gate here into the king's garden, watered by this channel. Again, just like at Mari, as we saw in Iraq, an attempt to convey this king as provisioner of prosperity for the people. All of this brings us to really our third point. But before I jump into it, are there any questions or comments, thoughts or concerns at this juncture as we think of symbolism of kingship in Israel? Okay. The last part is where I want to begin to assess Solomon, and for us to think as the people of God what it means to live faithfully as his people, as we are involved in cultural engagement. So I show you this. What does it look like, right? I'm not sure. A cow udder, maybe. I think it's a hand. I think it's a hand. Most scholars have argued it's a hand. And you can see at the top of this image a bunch of etchings. This is really what makes this an important piece of limestone. Do you see these etchings up here? Some of them kind of look intentional. This is a piece of limestone that was found in a tomb just outside of Jerusalem. 20-minute drive from Jerusalem. It's a tomb that had in it an inscription here, and several others as well, that were revolutionary because these date to just a couple of generations after Solomon. Now, in some ways, they're revolutionary from an archaeological perspective. From a biblical perspective, those who were reading the Bible when these were being found in the 1970s and 1980s weren't all that blown away. But nevertheless, let me show you what a translation of the inscription says. This was the tomb of a guy named Uryahu, an official, and his inscription, accompanied by this carving of a hand, perhaps the hand of God reaching down to save him. Bless Uryahu by Yahweh against his enemies, and bless him by his wife, Asherah. Let him save him. That's what the inscription says in total. 20-minute drive outside Jerusalem, written in Hebrew, a couple of generations after Solomon. What's mind-blowing about this is the obvious, right? Did you know Yahweh had a wife named Asherah? You did in some ways, right? When you look at the biblical text, this is one of those things that we see repeatedly there in the prophets. Those grumpy, curmudgeon-like prophets. "O Israel, you failed again." And over again, they say to us Israel, why do you worship the goddess Asherah? Why are you caught up in this worship of Asherah? Moreover, the biblical text, as though they're great storytellers, they drop all sorts of hints. Solomon sent to the Phoenicians for craftsmen. The Phoenicians sent along with wives. Solomon's wives lead his heart astray. And we find, for example, in Kings 23, 2 Kings 23, there recounting 350 years after Solomon's reign. The biblical writers know what's been going on. Finally, a king comes along who says enough is enough, and we're not going to worship the goddess Asherah. And it describes how he tears down the altars to the goddess Asherah. 350 years after Solomon, which it says had been standing since the time of Solomon. The question of cultural engagement. You can begin to process the challenges of someone like Solomon to be, God's promise, a great nation. And yet at the same time, as he has to think about presenting himself as the leader of a great nation, some of the problems inherent, the pitfalls he's going to encounter as he adopts and adapts those cultural symbols. Of course, the one we're really getting at here is the symbol of the palm tree. What did that symbol of the palm tree get at, or what was it explicit, the idea of flora in Mesopotamia or in Syria? It was associated with that female deity, wasn't it? We, in fact, saw the representation of that female deity in Mesopotamia, connected with this. And Solomon says, I'm going to use that symbol. Maybe even we might say today in Christian parlance, redeem that symbol. There are some symbols that we look at and we say, I don't like it at all, but it could work this way. Solomon just seems incapable of completely refashioning that symbol, or it's misunderstood by the people whom he rules, who see this symbol as saying Yahweh and his wife made him the provisioner of prosperity for the people. And so the prophet's career spins on, right? Critiquing, offering criticism of what transpires in Israel for centuries to follow. As Christians, and here I want to tread lightly, but I also want to share with you what I genuinely think. I think as Christians, we live in a time in which it's very difficult to think about cultural engagement. One of the ways I think that we sometimes can be more critical of our own cultural context is when we think of, say, for example, that virtue of freedom. There's a word that's a great biblical word. It's also a word that's ubiquitous in our culture. But do we mean the same thing when we use this linguistic symbol? Is it, perhaps, as it's sometimes used in culture, as a symbol to mean you can do anything at all you want? Is that what freedom means? Is that what we mean when we use it? Or might we go back to the biblical text and say, we need to reclaim this word? Because freedom, as we read Jesus describe freedom is the willingness to give up our lives, to be obedient. We are free to be obedient, not to do what, free to be obedient. And of course, you, I could imagine, might come up with many other ways in which cultural engagement in your own lives are tricky, in the workplace, in the family, community, etc. Are there questions, comments, queries, thoughts, or concerns? Yes? That's this. That must have been June 10th, 2000, when I took this photo. Yeah, it's a long time ago. Other questions? Yeah.
Why could that not be read, bless Uriah by Yahweh?
Uh-huh.
And by Uriah's wife, Asherah. Let him save them.
Ah. Yeah, it's a clever solution There's several reasons why it can't be. One of them is grammatical, but the other one really is we now have, this is not the only inscription that mentions Yahweh and his wife now. So we have many of them that now talk about Yahweh and his wife. Let me show you one other image as well, just to kind of punctuate that. I didn't want to go too far. We had questions. This is another one. This is actually a stupendous find. It's an incense stand. You would burn incense on the top of it. You can see the top of it here. But what's beautiful about it is, of course, the iconography. You can see it in the Israel Museum. This actually dates from the 10th century. This is from the time of Solomon. But what's stupendous about this is the way the iconography is typically understood is you'll notice in the bottom register, and you can see the detail here in the drawing vis-a-vis the actual terracotta here, the female deity, they're nude, right, associated with fertility. Someone fortuitously asked, what was that animal in that fresco? It was the lion. There's the lion. That's her association as well. Here, you'll see what is, I think, an interchangeable symbol. We're now in the third register here. An interchangeable symbol for that female deity. There's the flora. Again, the lions, and often the flora is flanked by two ibexes or goats. So we have a female deity and symbolism associated with her here and here. And then in registers 2 and 4, this is where it becomes quite interesting. You have two winged seraphim, cherubim, with an open hole, a window. This is found in Israel. Might you imagine why there would be an aniconic opening here? Most scholars argue this is the Israelites unwilling to portray Yahweh artistically. Because there's his wife, there's Yahweh, there's his wife, and then in the top register, a horse with a sun disk over the top. Again, back to the biblical text, when we think of those reforms that tear down the altars to Asherah, Yahweh's wife, it also talks about how Josiah took the horses dedicated to the sun out of the temple. So back to this idea of Yahweh and his wife. This seems to be something deeply woven into the culture of ancient Israel, which is why the prophets, right, are constantly, recurrently criticizing, saying, no, don't adopt culture mindlessly. Do it differently as the people of God faithfully, which is a hard task. I think this is an important reminder for us as well. When we read the prophets, it's easy to think of, oh, the people of God in the Old Testament, how foolish were they? It's a hard task, isn't it, to live faithfully in culture? I think it's a hard task. Yes?
I'm confused about the horse. Can
Yes.
you say more about that?
Yes, I think the horse is associated with power. It's another cultural symbol. It's a cultural symbol. Horses are prestige items, and they really emerge on the scene in terms of warfare around the time of Solomon and David. It's also, therefore, why I think it shows up in Deuteronomy. One of the things it says a king can't have is horses. Why? They don't want the king to be self-reliant. He's to rely on Yahweh, not on horses. And so then you have these other strange narratives where David defeats people in battle, and he hamstrings all the horses because he doesn't want them brought into his kingdom. He's trying to be faithful. And then you have the next story of Solomon, who happens to have more horses than anybody on the block. And you think, oh boy, Solomon's not thinking about cultural symbols, and this is a sign of what's going on in his heart in terms of cultural adaptation and adopting of these symbols and all of the rest. And so I think it becomes connected with Yahweh because it's a symbol of power, of might. It's a military symbol. Other questions, comments, or queries? Yes?
Why was it so important to diminish the role of female over this whole period of time, or Hispanic?
In what way do you mean?
Well, it seems that they're trying to negate the impact of Yahweh's wife.
Yeah.
It just seems like we've moved from something where we have fertility and the femaleness of her
Yeah.
represented in perhaps we're moving away from.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great. So I'm going to answer your question. I'm not sure if this is at the level, at theological level, or do you want it at a historical level?
Actually, both.
Okay, both. Well, I'll do my best. Well, let me start with the theological. I think that the prophets and I think the Old Testament scriptures, this is a tricky issue, right, are aware of the fact that what they're doing is saying we're not going to affirm this vision of gods or the supernatural that's simply the human family writ large, because that's what it is. The patriarch, the matriarch, they have kids, the kids create chaos. and it goes crazy. God's not like us at all. I think the vision of the Old Testament, the vision the Old Testament presents of Yahweh is one in which, forgive me, I'm a bit of a Lord of the Rings geek, Sam Wise at one point in the deep, dark Mordor, all but defeated as Frodo himself lay exhausted, catches just a glimpse of a star. And Tolkien writes to this effect, Sam knew that there was something in the world that wasn't mired. There was something that wasn't mired by the evil of the world. There was something wholly transcendent. And Sam gets a wind and goes on to fight for good. I think the Old Testament vision of God is one of, he's not like us. At the same time, theologically, the prophets are then very careful at certain places to present Yahweh as having qualities in that context that are seen as feminine. So Isaiah will say Yahweh is like a mother to her young, protecting, caring for. So I think they're aware of that. I personally am quite convinced, I think this is an important thing for us as people who believe in Scripture as God's Word. I don't think that the biblical text, the Old Testament, is misogynistic. I think it's speaking to a culture that's misogynistic and is constantly trying to move it along, shepherd it along. Now, we stand at a very different from a very different perspective in the 21st century, and so sometimes it may not be doing enough for us, but it wasn't written in the 21st century, so we have to be careful in that sense, theologically. Historically, in this sense, I would actually argue that the biblical text is unlike, say, for example, ancient Iraq, where you find true misogynistic attempts to marginalize female deities without any presentation of or valorization of feminine qualities in the pantheon, to the exclusion of, or almost fetishizing this male deity as anything but feminine. So, again, in perspective, I'd want to see the Old Testament as a little bit more open. Yeah, it's a tricky question, but it's a good one.